The smell of burnt tobacco lingered in the air as the officer pressed the lit cigarette closer to her face, his lips curling into a smug smirk. "You people think you can just walk in here and act like you belong," he spat, his voice laced with venom. She didn't flinch, though her eyes burned with a mixture of pain and unshaken defiance. He expected fear, submission, anything but the steady, unyielding stare she gave him. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to humiliate her. But this? This was different. The scene had unfolded like a nightmare, raw and unprovoked. She had walked into the precinct unannounced, her posture casual but purposeful. Dressed in jeans and a plain blouse, she wasn't there in an official capacity. She was there for something personal, something she didn't expect would end in degradation. Yet, from the moment she crossed the threshold, his eyes had followed her, narrowing with suspicion, judging her without a single word exchanged. "What are you doing here?" His tone was cold, accusatory. "I'm here to," she started, but his raised hand silenced her, cutting her sentence in half. "Don't care. You don't belong here. Step aside, or I'll make you." The officer's words were sharp, like knives slicing through her dignity. The other officers barely glanced up from their desks. It was clear, they wouldn't intervene. This wasn't new to them. It wasn't shocking. It was routine. When she didn't move, his anger escalated. His voice thundered through the room. "I said, step back." Before she could respond, he reached for her arm, his grip firm and bruising. "You're under suspicion for loitering. Got ID?" He didn't wait for an answer, pulling her forcefully toward a chair. The room seemed to close in as whispers began to fill the space. She could feel the weight of their gazes. She could hear their quiet laughs. But she didn't resist. Not yet. "Search her," he barked to another officer, who hesitated before muttering, "You sure about this?" "I said search her," the first officer snapped. His colleague looked uncomfortable but complied, patting her down roughly as if to emphasize the lack of respect she deserved. She stayed silent. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, not from fear but from the rage boiling just beneath her calm exterior. "You're going to regret this," she said finally, her voice low and steady, like a warning. He sneered. "What's there to regret? People like you don't get to walk in here and act like you own the place." The humiliation peaked when he pulled out his lighter, flicked it on, and hovered it in front of her face. The room fell silent as he leaned in closer, the glowing cigarette tip inches from her skin. "Let's see if that attitude burns off." The searing pain hit her cheek, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a scream. Her lips stayed sealed, her eyes locked on his, daring him to go further. It wasn't the pain that broke her, it was the realization of how deep his hatred ran. It was in his eyes, his actions, his complete lack of humanity. And it wasn't just him. The silence from everyone in the room spoke volumes. Not one of them stood up, not one voice called out in protest. She was alone in her fight. Except she wasn't. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know the power she wielded. He didn't know that the very ground he stood on had been paved by her efforts, by her leadership. The irony was thick enough to choke on, and yet, she remained silent. This wasn't the time for revelation. Not yet. As he pulled back, satisfied with his work, she finally spoke again. "You've made a mistake." He laughed. "Oh, I doubt that." Her face still stung, but her resolve was unshaken. "You will." The words were a promise, not a threat, but they hung in the air like an ominous cloud. Something in her tone made him falter for the briefest moment, but his arrogance quickly returned. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning his back on her. The events that followed would shock not just him, but everyone who had been complicit in that room. What was about to unfold would tear through the precinct like wildfire, exposing secrets, dismantling careers, and flipping the narrative on its head. The man who held the cigarette would soon wish he had never laid eyes on her. But how could one moment of prejudice, one act of hatred, unravel an entire system? How could someone go from victim to victor in a matter of days? What was it about her that made the tables turn so completely? The answers lay in what came next, a series of revelations so powerful, so devastating, that no one involved would leave unscathed. What happened to him was beyond imagination. What happened to her? That was the real story. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To our black viewers and all allies watching today, know that your voice matters, your story matters, and we're here to highlight narratives that confront injustice and inspire change. Let's create a community that values respect, equality, and humanity above all. Enjoy today's gripping story, and if you're moved by it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful twists and turns. Thank you for being here, and now, let's dive into the story. It was a typical morning in Greenfield, a mid-sized city in the heart of Missouri where the skyline was modest, but the tension in certain precincts was anything but. The streets buzzed with the rhythm of life, from bustling coffee shops to the hum of commuters. Nestled among the ordinary streets was the Greenfield Police Department, an imposing brick building with faded paint and an air of unshakable authority. To the untrained eye, it was just another government building, but for those who worked there, or were dragged into its walls, it was a place where reputations were built or shattered, depending on who you were. Maya Thompson had spent her entire career in law enforcement, a world she had navigated with precision and quiet strength. At 42, she was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had climbed the ranks not through favoritism but through relentless hard work and an unyielding moral compass. She was born and raised in the same city, the youngest daughter of a single mother who had worked nights cleaning offices to make ends meet. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood, Maya had seen firsthand how the system could fail people who looked like her. It was what drove her to choose law enforcement as a career, determined to change the system from the inside. Her success was proof that she hadn't just survived the odds, she had thrived despite them. Though her position as chief of police gave her power, Maya had learned to wield it judiciously. She was respected statewide, known for her integrity and unwavering commitment to justice. But she didn't flaunt her authority. Maya believed in the quiet power of actions over words, a philosophy that often made her underestimated. It was precisely that underestimation that allowed her to move unnoticed when she wasn't in uniform or flashing her badge. It gave her insight into the world as it was, not as it pretended to be. On this particular morning, Maya had dressed casually, jeans, a plain navy blouse, and her hair tied back into a simple ponytail. The only accessory she carried was her leather tote bag, which held her essentials. She'd decided to visit the Greenfield precinct unannounced, as she often did, to get a real sense of how things were running. Maya didn't trust prepared presentations or cherry-picked statistics, she trusted her instincts and her ability to read people. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with the aroma of stale coffee and the sound of phones ringing off the hook. It was a bustling hub, with officers moving between desks and files piled high in chaotic towers. Among the officers on duty that morning was Sean Hartley, a 37-year-old sergeant who had become infamous within the department for his abrasive demeanor. Sean was the kind of cop who thrived on the illusion of power, wielding his badge like a shield to justify his actions. His record was spotless on paper, but his behavior spoke volumes to those who had encountered him. Sean had a reputation for being dismissive, particularly toward black citizens, and for pushing boundaries in ways that often skirted the edge of misconduct. He had never been formally reprimanded, a fact that emboldened him further. Sean had grown up in a different part of Greenfield, a predominantly white suburb where his father was a well-respected lawyer and his mother a stay-at-home parent. His upbringing had been marked by privilege, and though he joined the force claiming he wanted to serve and protect, it was clear to many that his definition of protection didn't extend to everyone. Sean was tall, broad-shouldered, and always impeccably dressed in his uniform, a figure who commanded attention but rarely earned respect from his colleagues. When Maya walked through the precinct doors that morning, she immediately felt the weight of the room shift. She wasn't in uniform, and without the badge to shield her, the subtle undercurrents of prejudice in the department became glaringly obvious. As she approached the front desk, the officer stationed there barely looked up before muttering a curt, "What do you need?" Maya's voice was calm, polite. She asked for access to certain records and explained her business briefly, though without revealing her title. The officer seemed uninterested and pointed her toward the waiting area. She complied, taking a seat and pulling out her phone. It wasn't long before Sean Hartley noticed her. From across the room, he saw a black woman, dressed simply, sitting in his precinct as if she belonged. That was all it took to set him off. Sean approached her with his usual air of arrogance. He didn't ask her name or why she was there, instead, he demanded to know what she thought she was doing. When she tried to explain, he interrupted, his tone growing sharper with each word. His questions turned to accusations. Did she have identification? Was she loitering? Was she causing a disturbance? The idea that she could be there on legitimate business didn't cross his mind, or perhaps it did, and he simply didn't care. Maya kept her composure as Sean's voice grew louder, drawing the attention of others in the room. The tension was palpable, a mix of curiosity and unease as officers glanced over but said nothing. She answered his questions calmly, but it only seemed to irritate him further. Sean thrived on dominance, on making others feel small, and Maya's quiet dignity was like fuel to his fire. When he grabbed her arm, yanking her out of her seat, the room fell silent. No one intervened. No one stopped him as he led her toward a holding room under the pretense of conducting a search. In that moment, Maya knew this wasn't about protocol or suspicion. It was about power, his need to assert it and her refusal to relinquish it. But she didn't resist. She didn't argue. She let him lead her into that room, knowing that every action he took would speak louder than anything she could say. Sean's confidence swelled as he closed the door behind them. He thought he was in control, that he could handle the situation however he pleased without consequence. He had no idea who she was, no clue about the storm he was about to unleash on himself and the department. Maya sat quietly, her eyes never leaving his, as he began his tirade, his words cutting but revealing more about his character than hers. What Sean saw as submission was, in reality, something far more powerful, patience. She let him dig his own grave, word by word, action by action. Maya wasn't just a woman sitting in a precinct that morning. She was a lesson waiting to be learned. And soon, everyone in that building would understand the cost of underestimating her. The air in the holding room was stifling, heavy with tension and unspoken truths. Sean paced back and forth, his boots clicking sharply against the tile floor. Maya sat in the metal chair, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. To an outsider, it might have looked like a quiet interrogation, but the energy in the room told a different story. Sean's movements were erratic, his frustration palpable as he struggled to assert control over a situation he didn't fully understand. He leaned forward, his hands planted firmly on the table between them. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" His tone was accusatory, almost venomous. "Walking in here like you own the place, like the rules don't apply to you. I've seen people like you before. Always have something to say, always pushing the line." Maya met his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm not pushing any line. I came here for legitimate reasons. But you decided that wasn't enough for you, didn't you?" Sean's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to people challenging him, much less someone who refused to cower under his authority. "You're not in a position to question me. I'm the one in charge here. Are you?" Maya's voice was steady, almost disarming. It wasn't a challenge, it was a question that lingered in the air like a loaded gun. Sean slammed his hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing in the small room. "Watch your tone. You're already in enough trouble." "For what, exactly?" Maya tilted her head slightly, her voice laced with a quiet defiance. "For sitting in the waiting area. For existing in a space you think I don't belong in? Or is it because you need someone to remind you of your power? Sean's jaw tightened. You don't get to talk to me like that. The door opened abruptly, and another officer stepped in. Officer Daniels, a younger man with a nervous energy, glanced between them. He hesitated before speaking, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. Sergeant Hartley, is everything under control here? Sean shot him a glare. I have it under control. Close the door. Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting to Maya, who remained composed despite the charged atmosphere. Are you sure this is? I said close the door, Sean snapped, cutting him off. Daniels swallowed hard and stepped back, the door clicking shut behind him. The exchange hadn't gone unnoticed by Maya. It was a small crack in Sean's facade, a glimpse of uncertainty that hinted at a deeper insecurity. You don't like being questioned, do you? Maya's words were deliberate, calculated. You've built this little world for yourself where no one can challenge you, where your badge gives you the right to treat people however you want. But what happens when that world starts to crumble? Sean's laugh was short and humorless. You're in no position to lecture me. You're just another nobody who thinks they can walk into my precinct and act like they matter. Maya leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. If that's what you believe, then why are you so angry? Why are you trying so hard to prove something to me? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Sean straightened up, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, and it was clear that Maya's composure was rattling him. He moved to the corner of the room, his back to her as he muttered under his breath, too low for her to hear. She watched him closely, noting every detail, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands twitched, the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. Outside the room, the precinct was alive with activity. Officers moved through the hallways, their conversations overlapping in a steady hum. But there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Daniel stood near the door, his expression conflicted. He had been in the department long enough to know Sean's tendencies, and while he had never directly confronted him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time, things had gone too far. Inside, the standoff continued. Sean turned back to face Maya, his expression hardening. You think you're so clever, don't you? Sitting there, acting all high and mighty. But let me tell you something, this is my precinct. My rules. And you're not going to walk out of here thinking you can talk to me like that. Maya's response was quiet but firm. You're right about one thing. I'm not walking out of here the same way I came in. But it won't be for the reasons you think. Sean took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. You're playing a dangerous game. And you've already lost, Maya replied, her tone as sharp as a blade. You just don't know it yet. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sean stared at her, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. For the first time, he seemed to falter, as if a small part of him realized that he was in over his head. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Outside, Daniels lingered near the door, his unease growing by the second. He wasn't the only one. Other officers exchanged uneasy glances, the whispers of concern spreading through the precinct like wildfire. There was something about the way Maya carried herself, the quiet confidence that suggested she was more than she appeared to be. And while most of them didn't know the full story, they couldn't shake the feeling that Sean had made a grave mistake. Inside the holding room, Sean's frustration reached its boiling point. He leaned over the table, his voice a harsh whisper. You think you're untouchable? You think you can sit there and talk down to me like I'm nothing? Let me tell you something, people like you don't get to make the rules. You don't get to win. Maya met his glare head-on, her voice unwavering. And people like you don't get to decide who matters. You don't get to abuse your power without consequences. And when those consequences come, I hope you're ready. Her words struck a nerve, and for a brief moment, Sean's mask slipped. The anger in his eyes was replaced by something else, fear, perhaps, or the realization that he was no longer in control. But the moment was fleeting, and he quickly regained his composure, straightening up and turning away from her. The silence between them was deafening, the weight of unspoken truths filling the room. Maya remained seated, her expression calm but resolute. She knew the storm was coming, and she was ready for it. Sean, on the other hand, had no idea what was about to hit him. As the tension in the precinct continued to build, the whispers outside the holding room grew louder. The officers who had once ignored the situation were now paying attention, their curiosity and unease mounting with each passing moment. Daniels glanced toward the captain's office, his mind racing as he debated whether to intervene. But before he could make a move, the door to the holding room opened, and Sean stepped out, his face a mask of barely contained anger. He didn't say a word as he walked past his colleagues, his jaw clenched and his fists tight at his sides. Maya remained inside, her calm demeanor unshaken. She knew the game had only just begun, and the next move would be hers. The precinct was uncharacteristically quiet, a tension simmering beneath the surface that no one dared to name aloud. The whispers had stopped, replaced by cautious glances and muted movements. Everyone knew something was happening, though the details remained unclear. Maya sat in the small holding room, her expression calm but her mind sharp, piecing together the events that had brought her here. Outside, Sean Hartley paced like a restless predator, his frustration mounting with every step. He had convinced himself that he still had control, but deep down, a small part of him felt the grip slipping. The silence broke when the precinct doors opened, and a tall, impeccably dressed man entered, flanked by two assistants and carrying an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. His tailored suit and polished shoes were a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. This was Thomas Rivers, a senior investigator from the state's Internal Affairs Division. His presence alone sent a ripple through the building, officers exchanging uneasy looks as he approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Sergeant Hartley," Rivers said, his voice steady but firm. The desk officer nodded nervously and gestured toward the back. Rivers didn't wait for an escort, striding through the precinct with purpose, his gaze unwavering. As he passed the rows of desks, the officers fell silent, their curiosity and unease palpable. When he reached Sean, who was leaning against a file cabinet, the tension in the room thickened. "Sergeant Hartley," Rivers began, his tone even but authoritative. "We need to talk. Now." Sean straightened, his jaw tightening. "About what?" "I've got work to do." "This isn't a request," Rivers replied, his gaze piercing. "It's about the events that took place here earlier." Sean hesitated for a moment before nodding and leading Rivers to his office. The door closed behind them, leaving the precinct in a charged silence. Inside, Rivers wasted no time. "Explain to me what happened this morning," he demanded, pulling out a notebook and pen. Sean leaned back in his chair, trying to appear nonchalant. It was a routine situation. A woman showed up without proper identification, refused to answer questions, and became uncooperative. "I handled it." Rivers raised an eyebrow. "Handled it? That's an interesting choice of words. Do you consider detaining someone without cause and physically intimidating them part of your routine?" Sean's composure faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "She was acting suspicious. I did what I had to do." Rivers leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You had to burn her face with a cigarette?" Sean froze, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rivers didn't blink. "We have witnesses, Sergeant. People who saw what happened. And there's more." Before Sean could respond, the door opened, and Maya stepped in, her presence commanding the room despite her casual attire. Sean's face turned pale as the realization hit him, this wasn't a routine investigation. This was something far bigger. Rivers stood, nodding respectfully toward Maya. Chief Thompson. Sean's eyes widened in disbelief. Chief. What the hell is going on? Maya's gaze was cold, her voice steady. What's going on, Sergeant, is accountability. Something you've managed to avoid for far too long. Sean stammered, his arrogance cracking under the weight of her words. You can't be serious. This is some kind of joke, right? No joke, Maya replied, stepping closer. What you did this morning wasn't just unprofessional, it was criminal. And you thought you could get away with it because you assumed I was nobody. But I am somebody, Sergeant Hartley. And you're about to face the consequences of your actions. Sean's bravado shattered completely. I didn't know who you were, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Maya's expression hardened. That's the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. No one deserves to be treated the way you treated me, or anyone else, for that matter. Your behavior isn't just a disgrace to this department, it's a danger to the community you claim to serve. Rivers stepped in, his tone final. Sergeant Hartley, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. You're also being reported to the State Review Board for misconduct. Sean's face turned red with anger and humiliation. You can't do this to me. I've given my life to this job. And that's what makes this so tragic, Maya replied, her voice filled with quiet disappointment. You had the power to make a difference, to protect and serve with honor. Instead, you chose to abuse it. Sean's protests fell on deaf ears as Rivers motioned for two officers to escort him out. The precinct was silent as they watched Sean Hartley, once so confident and untouchable, being led away, his career unraveling in real time. Maya stood in the center of it all, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions within her. She hadn't just come here to expose one man's corruption, she had come to set a precedent, to show that no one, regardless of rank or reputation, was above accountability. As the doors closed behind Sean, Maya turned to Rivers. This isn't just about one officer. There's a culture here that needs to change. Rivers nodded. And it starts with leadership like yours. We'll make sure this doesn't get buried. Maya glanced around the room, her gaze meeting the eyes of every officer present. I'm not here to destroy this department. I'm here to rebuild it. And I'll need all of you to decide which side of history you want to stand on. The silence was deafening, but the message was clear. Change was coming, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. The precinct was still, the hum of tension thick in the air as officers struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Sean Hartley, the untouchable, had been let out in cuffs, his bravado shattered. The man who had dominated the department with intimidation and arrogance was now powerless. Maya stood at the center of it all, calm but commanding, her presence a quiet storm that no one dared underestimate anymore. One officer, a middle-aged man named Officer Daniels, stepped forward hesitantly. His voice was low, uncertain. Chief Thompson, I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were. Maya turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable but heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. That's exactly the problem, Officer Daniels. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. What happened here today wasn't about my rank or my position. It was about the way this department operates, the way people like Sean Hartley are allowed to abuse their power while everyone else looks the other way. Daniel swallowed hard, his discomfort evident. I never supported what he did. You have to believe me. She studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Did you speak out against it? Did you ever try to stop him, or did you just stay silent and hope someone else would? Daniels dropped his gaze, shame coloring his face. I thought it wasn't my place. I was afraid. Her voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. Afraid of what? Losing your job. Your reputation. How do you think the people Sean targeted felt? How do you think they felt walking into this precinct, knowing they wouldn't be treated with respect, knowing no one would stand up for them? Another officer, younger and visibly shaken, spoke up from across the room. I didn't know it was that bad. I mean, I knew he could be harsh, but, he trailed off, his voice faltering. Maya turned her attention to him, her tone measured but firm. You knew enough. You all did. Don't pretend this is a revelation. The signs were there, the complaints, the whispers. But no one wanted to deal with it because it was easier to let it slide, easier to keep the peace than to challenge someone like Sean. The weight of her words hung over the room, pressing down on the officers like an unrelenting tide. Some looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze, while others seemed to grapple with the truth of what she was saying. For years, they had allowed a culture of silence and complicity to thrive. Now, that culture was being dismantled in front of them, piece by piece. Rivers stepped forward, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Chief Thompson, we'll need your formal statement to move forward with the investigation. And not just about today, about everything. We're reopening old cases tied to Sergeant Hartley and reviewing his record in full. Maya nodded, her posture unyielding. Good. But don't stop there. This department needs more than an investigation into one man. It needs a complete overhaul. Policies, training, accountability, everything needs to be examined. Rivers inclined his head in agreement. We'll do what's necessary. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take leadership. Leadership that people trust. Maya's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the officers who now stood in quiet contemplation. Leadership starts with each of you. It's not enough to say you're not part of the problem. You have to be part of the solution. If you see something wrong, speak up. If you know someone's crossing the line, hold them accountable. That's how we rebuild trust, not just within this department, but with the community we serve. Daniels hesitated before speaking again, his voice tentative. What if we don't know how to start? What if we've been part of this for so long that we don't know how to change? Maya's expression softened, a flicker of compassion breaking through her stern exterior. Change isn't easy, Officer Daniels. It's uncomfortable, and it requires all of us to confront things we'd rather ignore. But it starts with a choice. A choice to do better, to be better. And if you're willing to make that choice, I'll be here to help you every step of the way. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of guilt or fear. It was the silence of reflection, of officers grappling with the realization that they had a chance to be part of something bigger, something better. For the first time in years, the precinct didn't feel like a fortress of unchecked power. It felt like the beginning of something new. As Rivers began coordinating with his team to start the investigation, Maya stepped out of the holding room and into the main precinct. The eyes of her colleagues followed her, a mixture of respect and uncertainty in their gazes. She knew this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that real change was possible. Daniels approached her cautiously as she stood near the front desk. Chief Thompson, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For not speaking up sooner. Maya looked at him, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Don't apologize to me, Daniels. Apologize to the people who were hurt because of your silence. And then do better. That's all I ask. He nodded, his face earnest. I will. As the precinct began to stir with the activity of the investigation, Maya stepped outside, the cool air hitting her face like a bomb. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that still needed to be done. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet, a moment to feel the weight of what had been accomplished. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Rivers. We've got everything we need to move forward. The system's going to feel this one, Chief. Thank you. Maya allowed herself a small, fleeting smile before slipping the phone back into her pocket. The system was finally feeling the pressure, but this was only the beginning. There were still battles to fight, still lives to protect and voices to amplify. And she wasn't going to stop until every last corner of the department reflected the values she had dedicated her life to. As she turned to head back inside, a sense of purpose settled over her. The fight for justice was far from over, but today, it had taken a step forward. And for Maya, that was enough to keep going. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity. The Greenfield Police Department became the epicenter of scrutiny, with journalists camping outside, internal investigators poring over files, and community leaders demanding answers. What had once been a bastion of unchecked authority was now under the microscope, its every flaw exposed to the glaring light of public accountability. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of tension and unease, with officers walking on eggshells, unsure of what would come next. Maya moved through the precinct with a steady presence, her every step purposeful. She wasn't there to bask in the aftermath of Sean Hartley's fall, she was there to ensure that the momentum wasn't lost. The reformation she had been quietly pushing for years was now within reach, and she intended to seize the moment. Yet, the road ahead was fraught with resistance, both overt and covert. Not everyone in the department was ready to embrace change, and some actively resented her for forcing their hand. One of those voices came from Lieutenant Marshall, a veteran officer who had been with the department for over 2 decades. Marshall had built his career alongside men like Hartley, and while he wasn't as openly abrasive, his reluctance to challenge the status quo made him complicit. He approached Maya one afternoon as she reviewed policy recommendations in the conference room. "I need a word," he said, his tone clipped. Maya didn't look up immediately, finishing the note she was writing before setting her pen down. "What's on your mind, Lieutenant?" Marshall crossed his arms, his posture defensive. This circus you've brought down on us. It's tearing the department apart." Maya met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "The department was already broken, Marshall. I'm just exposing the cracks." He scoffed. "You think dragging our name through the mud is going to fix anything? You think firing Hartley and bringing in the state is going to make the community trust us again?" Maya stood, her voice steady but firm. "Trust isn't given, Marshall. It's earned. And right now, this department hasn't earned it. People don't feel safe coming here. They don't see us as protectors. They see us as threats. That has to change." Marshall shook his head, his frustration evident. "And you think you're the one to change it? You think a few policies and some PR will undo years of history?" "It's not about undoing the past," Maya replied, her tone unwavering. "It's about building a future where this department serves everyone, not just a select few. If you can't get on board with that, then maybe it's time to reevaluate your place here." Marshall's face darkened, but he said nothing, turning and leaving the room without another word. Maya watched him go, a familiar pang of exhaustion settling over her. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, that resistance like Marshall's would be a constant barrier. But she also knew that change was rarely welcomed with open arms. It was demanded, fought for, and earned through persistence. Outside the precinct, the community's response was a mixture of cautious optimism and deep skepticism. Activists who had spent years advocating for reform were vocal in their support of Maya's efforts, but many residents remained wary. They had seen promises of change before, only to be met with disappointment. Maya understood their hesitance and made it a point to meet with community leaders, listening to their concerns and sharing her vision for the future. One such meeting was with Reverend James Carter, a prominent figure in the local black community. The Reverend had been a vocal critic of the police for years, and his endorsement carried significant weight. The two met in his modest church office, the air thick with the scent of old wood and faded hymnals. Reverend Carter leaned back in his chair, studying Maya carefully. "You've stirred up quite the storm, Chief. People are talking, and not all of it's good." Maya nodded, her hands resting on the desk between them. "I didn't come here to make friends, Reverend. I came here to make a difference. He raised an eyebrow. And you think firing one bad cop is enough to make a difference? Hartley wasn't the disease, Maya. He was a symptom. I know that, she replied, her voice steady. That's why this isn't just about Hartley. It's about changing the culture that allowed him to thrive, about holding everyone accountable, including myself. The Reverend tilted his head, his expression softening slightly. That's a tall order. You're going to face pushback, from inside and outside the department. I already am, Maya said with a faint smile. But that's not going to stop me. Reverend Carter studied her for a moment longer before nodding. You've got my support, Chief. But understand this, my people have been burned before. Promises were made, and they were broken. If you're serious about this, you need to deliver. No more empty words. You have my word, Maya said firmly. And I don't make promises I can't keep. The Reverend leaned forward, extending a hand. Maya shook it, the weight of the gesture not lost on her. This was more than an endorsement, it was a commitment to hold her accountable. And she welcomed it. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere remained tense. The internal investigation was uncovering more than just Hartley's misdeeds, old cases were being reopened, complaints that had been swept under the rug were being re-examined, and the patterns of systemic issues were coming to light. Officers who had once turned a blind eye were now being called to answer for their inaction, and the pressure was mounting. Among the officers, Daniels was one of the few who seemed genuinely committed to change. He approached Maya one evening as she reviewed files in her office, his expression earnest. "Chief, can I talk to you?" he asked, hovering near the doorway. "Come in, Daniels," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. He sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About accountability. And, you're right. I could have done more. I should have done more." Maya set down the file she was reading, giving him her full attention. "Acknowledging that is the first step, Daniels. But it's just the beginning. What are you going to do now?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to be part of the solution. Whatever it takes, I want to help fix this department." Maya's gaze softened slightly. "It's not going to be easy. You're going to face pushback, and there will be times when it feels like you're fighting an uphill battle. But if you're serious about this, I'll support you." "I am serious," he said firmly. "I've seen what happens when we let things slide. I don't want to be that kind of cop anymore." Maya nodded, a small flicker of hope igniting within her. Change was coming, slowly but surely. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like progress wasn't just a distant dream, it was within reach. The precinct felt different now. The usual noise, the constant ringing phones, and the chatter between officers had softened into a subdued hum. The weight of recent events hung over the department, palpable in every glance exchanged, every hesitant step taken. Maya sat in her office, the desk cluttered with files, reports, and proposals. The reality of change was heavy, each document a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Daniel stepped inside, his posture tense but determined. His presence had grown more confident in the days since their last conversation, though there was still a hint of hesitation in his movements. Maya motioned for him to sit, setting aside the file she had been reviewing. He leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly. "I've been looking through some of the old cases," he began, his voice steady but low. "The ones Hartley handled. There's a pattern, Chief. Complaints from the same neighborhoods, the same families, over and over again. It's like he had a target." Maya nodded, her face impassive but her mind racing. "That doesn't surprise me. People like Hartley thrive on repetition. They pick their targets carefully, knowing who's least likely to fight back or be believed. It's systemic." Daniels exhaled deeply, frustration etched into his features. How do we even begin to fix this? It's so much bigger than one man. It's the way the whole system is built. Maya leaned forward, her gaze sharp and unwavering. We start by dismantling that system, piece by piece. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy, but we take it one step at a time. We hold people accountable. We listen to the communities that have been silenced. And we don't stop, no matter how much resistance we face. Daniels nodded, the fire in his eyes mirroring hers. I'm with you, Chief. Whatever it takes. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. Rivers entered, his usual composed demeanor tinged with urgency. He carried a folder in one hand and gestured for Daniels to stay seated. "We found more," Rivers said, placing the folder on Maya's desk. "It's worse than we thought." Hartley wasn't acting alone. Maya's brow furrowed as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were records, complaints, and testimonies that painted a damning picture. Hartley had allies, officers who had either actively participated in or turned a blind eye to his misconduct. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. "How many?" Maya asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. "At least 6 officers," Rivers replied. "And those are just the ones we've identified so far. There could be more." Daniels looked between them, his face pale. 6. How did this go unnoticed for so long? "Because no one wanted to notice," Maya said, closing the folder. "It was easier to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But that stops now." Rivers leaned against the edge of the desk, his expression serious. "We're going to need more than just internal reforms, Chief. This is going to require a public reckoning. These officers need to be held accountable, not just internally, but legally." Maya nodded, her mind already racing with the implications. "We'll cooperate with whatever investigations are necessary. But we also need to be proactive. Transparency is key. If we don't show the community that we're serious about this, we'll lose whatever trust we've started to rebuild." Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The community, they're not going to forgive us easily, are they?" Maya's gaze softened, her voice steady. "Forgiveness isn't the goal, Daniels. Accountability is. Forgiveness might come later, or it might not. But what matters is that we do the right thing, even if it's hard, even if it's uncomfortable." Rivers nodded in agreement. "She's right. This isn't about making people like us. It's about earning their respect, their trust. And that takes time." The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their task settling over them. Finally, Maya stood, her posture resolute. "Rivers, start preparing the documentation for the public. We're going to hold a press conference. Daniels, I want you to start reviewing every case these officers have touched in the last 5 years. If there are victims we haven't reached yet, I want to know about them." Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Chief." As Rivers and Daniels left the office, Maya sank back into her chair, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The depth of the corruption was staggering, but it wasn't surprising. She had always known that change would come with resistance, that the fight would expose more than just surface-level issues. But knowing and experiencing were 2 different things, and the reality of what lay ahead was daunting. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Reverend Carter, heard about the latest developments. "The community's watching closely. Don't let us down." Maya stared at the screen for a moment before typing a response, "I won't." She set the phone down and looked out the window, the city sprawling out before her. It was a city of contrasts, of hope and despair, of progress and stagnation. And it was hers to fight for, no matter how long it took. Later that evening, the precinct gathered for an all-hands meeting. Officers filled the room, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and quiet defiance. Maya stood at the front, her presence commanding but approachable. She took a moment to look at each of them before she spoke. "I know the last few weeks have been difficult," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "I know some of you feel like the ground is shifting beneath your feet. And it is. The way things have been, how we've operated, how we've treated the community, it's no longer acceptable. Change is here, whether you're ready for it or not." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm not here to tear this department down. I'm here to rebuild it into something we can all be proud of. But that won't happen unless we're willing to take a hard look at ourselves, to confront the things we've ignored for too long. This isn't just about Hartley or the officers who worked with him. It's about all of us. It's about deciding who we want to be moving forward." The room was silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. She saw some nods of agreement, others who avoided her gaze, and a few who looked outright resentful. But she pressed on. "This is your chance to be part of the solution. To stand up and say, this isn't who we are anymore. But it's a choice you have to make, and it's not an easy one. If you're not ready for that, if you're not willing to do the work, then this might not be the place for you. And that's okay. But if you are willing to stay, to fight for something better, then know that I'll fight alongside you." She stepped back, letting her words settle. The room remained silent for a long moment before Daniel stood, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I'm in." One by one, others followed, their voices hesitant at first but growing stronger. Maya watched as the tide began to shift, the seeds of change taking root. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. And for Maya, that was enough. For now. The precinct was quiet in the days following the department-wide meeting, but it was not the silence of avoidance or complacency. It was the silence of reflection, of officers grappling with their place in a system that had been exposed for its flaws. Maya felt the shift, subtle but unmistakable, in the way her colleagues carried themselves. Some avoided her gaze, their resistance to change still simmering just beneath the surface, while others seemed to approach their work with newfound purpose. She wasn't naive enough to believe that a single meeting or a series of firings would transform the department overnight, but she could see the cracks forming in the old ways. Change, she knew, often started with cracks. The investigation into Hartley and his network had unearthed more than even Maya had anticipated. Rivers had been relentless in his pursuit of the truth, and the findings painted a grim picture. Corruption wasn't confined to Hartley's actions, it was woven into the fabric of how certain cases were handled, how certain officers were protected. The discovery of these truths was both a victory and a sobering reminder of how deep the work ahead truly was. Maya sat in her office, the overhead light casting a soft glow on the stacks of files that had become her constant companions. Across from her sat Rivers, his usual calm exterior showing signs of wear. His tie was slightly loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and there was a weariness in his eyes that mirrored her own. "We've traced the network," Rivers said, sliding a file across her desk. "It's worse than we thought." Hartley wasn't just acting on his own prejudices. He was part of a group, a kind of unspoken alliance among certain officers. They covered for each other, falsified reports, buried complaints. And it's been going on for years. Maya flipped through the file, her jaw tightening as she scanned the contents. The names listed were familiar, some of them officers she had worked alongside for years. The weight of their betrayal settled heavily on her shoulders. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "At least a dozen," Rivers replied. "And that's just what we can prove so far. There are more, but without concrete evidence, it's going to be difficult to hold them accountable." Maya closed the file and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "What about the community? Do they know?" "Not yet," Rivers said. "We've been careful to keep this internal for now, but it's only a matter of time before it leaks. People are already talking, and once the press gets wind of this, they'll demand answers," Maya finished, her tone resolute. "And they'll deserve them." We can't keep this quiet, Rivers. If we're serious about accountability, we have to be transparent, even if it's messy. Rivers nodded, his respect for her evident in the way he listened. I agree. But you know what this will mean for the department. For you. I know, Maya said. But I didn't take this job to play it safe. If we lose trust now, we might never get it back. Rivers leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. There's something else. We've uncovered evidence that Hartley and his group were tampering with high-profile cases. Cases involving violent crimes, missing persons. If this gets out, it's going to shake the entire justice system. Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She had always known that change would come at a cost, but this was bigger than she had anticipated. She met Rivers' gaze, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Then we do what needs to be done. We bring everything to light. No more secrets, no more cover-ups. Whatever it takes, we fix this. Rivers nodded, his respect for her unwavering. I'll start preparing the statement. As he left the office, Maya allowed herself a brief moment of silence, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the city stretched before her, its lights flickering like distant stars. It was a city she loved, a city she had fought for, but it was also a city that had betrayed her in ways she couldn't ignore. And yet, she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when there was so much at stake. Later that evening, Maya attended a community forum held at a local church. The room was packed, the air buzzing with tension and anticipation. Residents of Greenfield filled the pews, their faces a mixture of anger, hope, and exhaustion. Reverend Carter stood at the front, his presence steadying the room as he introduced Maya. She's not here to make excuses, Carter said, his voice resonating through the space. She's here to tell the truth. And we owe it to ourselves to listen. Maya stepped forward, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She scanned the room, taking in the faces of the people she had sworn to serve and protect. These were the people who had been failed by the very institution she now led. She owed them more than words, but words were where she had to start. I won't stand here and tell you that everything is fine, she began, her voice carrying through the room. It's not. This department has failed you. It has failed the community it was meant to protect. And for that, I am sorry. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others crossing their arms in skepticism. Maya pressed on. The investigation into Sergeant Hartley and his associates has uncovered truths that are difficult to face. Corruption, misconduct, abuse of power, these are not just isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a system that has been allowed to operate without accountability for far too long. And while it would be easy to blame a few bad actors, the truth is that this is bigger than them. It's about the culture of silence, the fear of speaking out, the unwillingness to confront what's wrong. A man in the back stood, his voice sharp and angry. Why should we believe you? You're just another cop trying to save face. Maya met his gaze, her voice unwavering. You have every right to question me. And I don't expect you to trust me just because I'm standing here. Trust isn't something I can demand from you. It's something I have to earn. And I'm willing to do the work to earn it. The man hesitated, his anger softening slightly. He sat down, but the tension in the room remained. Maya continued. I can't undo the harm that's been done. I can't erase the past. But I can promise you this, we will not hide from the truth. We will hold people accountable, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. And we will rebuild this department into something that serves this community with integrity and respect. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. For a moment, Maya wondered if she had said enough, if she had reached them. Then, slowly, Reverend Carter began to clap. One by one, others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the room. It wasn't unanimous, and it wasn't euphoric, but it was a start. And for Maya, that was enough. For now. The days after the press conference were intense. The community's response was a mix of anger, disbelief, and cautious hope. But as the weeks passed, Maya could see the change she had fought for slowly taking root. The officers who had once been skeptical were beginning to accept the new reality, even if grudgingly. Some had already started to question the old ways, and a few, like Daniels, had fully embraced the commitment to change. Others, like Lieutenant Marshall, continued to resist, but even his defiance had started to take on a quieter, more passive form. He wasn't openly challenging Maya's authority anymore. Instead, he kept to the shadows, watching but not speaking out. For now, that was enough. The investigation into Hartley and his group had been thorough, the evidence undeniable. Several officers had been arrested, their careers irrevocably destroyed. It was a blow to the department, but one that needed to be struck. The community watched as the department purged itself of those who had been complicit in the corruption, and though it was painful, it was necessary. Justice, real justice, wasn't easy. It never was. One afternoon, as Maya walked through the precinct, she overheard a conversation between two officers. They were talking in low voices, but the words reached her nonetheless. "I'm telling you, there's been a shift," one officer said. "It's not the same around here anymore. People are starting to listen." The other officer responded, "Yeah, I've noticed. It's not just about the work anymore. It's about how we do it. And I think we're finally getting it right." Maya's heart swelled as she overheard these words, a quiet but profound confirmation that the foundation she was laying had begun to take hold. She had known from the start that this journey would be long and difficult, but it was moments like these, small, almost imperceptible shifts in attitude, that proved her efforts were not in vain. But the hardest part was still ahead of her, winning back the trust of the community. They had seen the department fail them time and time again. They had seen the corruption, the cover-ups, and the cruelty. Now, Maya had to prove that the changes weren't just a facade, that the department was genuinely committed to serving and protecting all people, not just the ones who could afford to look the other way. She decided to take a different approach, one that would put the community at the forefront of the process. Instead of staying behind closed doors, she began attending community meetings, sitting with residents, listening to their concerns, and involving them in the changes happening within the precinct. The town hall meetings became a weekly occurrence, with people showing up, not just to voice their grievances, but to see for themselves that Maya was committed to the long-term work of change. It wasn't always easy. There were heated exchanges, accusations, and moments when Maya wasn't sure she was making a difference. But each time she stood before the crowd, answering questions and listening to their pain, she saw the walls of mistrust slowly begin to crumble. The community began to believe her, to see that she wasn't just the chief of police, she was someone who understood their struggles, someone who would stand with them, no matter how difficult it became. One evening, after a particularly tense town hall, Maya walked out into the cool air, feeling both drained and oddly exhilarated. Reverend Carter was waiting for her outside, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Chief," he said, his voice gentle but strong. "I've seen the change in the people. They trust you now. They see you're not like the others." Maya smiled faintly, the weight of the past few months pressing down on her shoulders. "It's not enough yet. We still have a long road ahead." Reverend Carter nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "But you've done what many couldn't. You've shown them that things can change. That the past doesn't have to define the future." Maya looked out at the horizon, the city she had sworn to protect stretching before her. "It's just the beginning," she murmured. "There's still so much to be done." "Then let's make sure we keep going," Reverend Carter said with a firm nod. "Together." The following weeks saw more arrests, more officers brought to justice, but it was the ripple effect of those changes that began to matter most. The public started to see that the precinct wasn't just trying to salvage its reputation, it was genuinely changing, from the inside out. And when Maya sat down for her next meeting with the mayor, it was a conversation filled with promise. "We've seen the changes, Chief," the mayor said, his voice tinged with respect. "The department is on a better path now. And while we're not perfect, we're headed in the right direction." Maya nodded. "That's all I can ask for. But we can't stop now. We need to ensure that this culture doesn't return. We need to keep pushing forward." The mayor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "And we will. But know this, Chief, the city is watching you now. And they believe in what you're doing." Maya's chest tightened, but it was the kind of pressure she had learned to live with. The weight of responsibility was hers to bear, but she was no longer carrying it alone. The support from the community, from her officers, and from the people who had once doubted her was a powerful force. And then, just as things seemed to be settling into a new rhythm, Maya received a call she never expected. It was from Daniels. "Chief," he said, his voice tense, "there's been a development. One of the officers who was implicated in the investigation, Lieutenant Marshall, has gone rogue. He's been leaking information to some of the people we've investigated. It looks like he's trying to sabotage everything we've worked for." Maya's heart dropped. Marshall had been one of the most resistant officers, but she had hoped he would come around. Now, it seemed that hope had been misplaced. "I'm coming in," she said firmly, hanging up the phone. She couldn't let one person undo the progress they had made. Not after everything they had fought for. When she arrived at the precinct, she was met by Daniels and a few others who had been tracking Marshall's movements. He had been feeding information to a known gang leader, one of the many who had previously slipped through the cracks. Marshall had hoped to use the information to get back into the good graces of those who had been removed, but his betrayal wouldn't go unnoticed. With the evidence in hand, Maya confronted Marshall in his office, her voice cold but resolute. "You thought you could sabotage everything we've built," she said, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. "You thought you could go back to the way things were. But you're wrong." Marshall looked up, his eyes dark with defiance. "You can't win, Thompson. You've made too many enemies. You can't change everything." Maya's eyes hardened, but her voice remained steady. "Maybe not. But I can make sure that you never have the chance to destroy what we've built." With that, she handed over the evidence to the investigators, and Marshall's career came to a crashing halt. His fall was swift, and though it came with regret, Maya knew it had to happen. Justice had to be consistent. It couldn't be selective. As the dust settled, Maya stood at the front of the precinct, looking out at the officers who had been part of the journey. They had come so far. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the right path. The weight of the city's trust rested on her shoulders, but she was no longer carrying it alone. The community, the officers, and even the people who had once doubted her, they were all with her now. And together, they would continue to rebuild, piece by piece, until the department was something they could all be proud of. As the credits roll, think about what you've just witnessed. How far would you go to make a difference? Would you have the courage to face the system head-on and demand accountability? Or would you stay silent, allowing the world to keep turning as it always has? Let us know your thoughts. Comment below, share your feelings on the story, and reflect on the changes we all can bring about in our own lives. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. You don't want to miss what comes next. Until then, stay inspired, stay determined, and never stop fighting for what's right. 2 of 2